you have to be willing to take risk. I mean, there's not reward without risk. If you're in Columbus, Ohio, we are in one of the best markets in the country. And so I did go to my girlfriend's grandmother and borrowed $1,500 to buy my first property.
All right, Brent Crawford. Well, thank you first off for joining in and letting us drill you with questions on how you got into the business. You've been a mentor of mine. You gave me an opportunity as an internship 3 or 4 years ago. That turned into me working at Crawford Hoying, company you founded 28 years ago, and took it from one property on Ohio State's campus to now building, developing, acquiring properties all throughout the country over the last 28 years. So thank you for spending time with me. And I'll post some of the podcasts you've done previously so people know more information and more of your story. But today I'd like to focus on how you went not from first deal to now building Bridge Park, which, if the audience isn't familiar with Bridge Park, it's this one-of-a-kind development here in Columbus, Ohio, Dublin, mixed use, kind of beautiful ecosystem of people living, working, and playing here. But we're going to focus on you going from, let's say, 50 units to 1,000 units early on into your career. Anything else we should know about you before we start drilling you with questions?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Always glad to talk and share with you. But no, I think that's a good intro, and we'll just take it from there.
All right, so let's get this out of the way. How'd you start in the real estate game? There's been a couple fun stories that I've learned from you relating to a certain person's loan to you when you're 18 or 20 or however young, teacher investor. Let's start with those stories.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I can't say that when I graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to be in real estate. To be honest, I wasn't sure. Other than saying I probably felt like I was always going to be in business for myself. I think it was always my mindset. I always sort of had a motivation to do something great, I guess, in my mind. And it always felt like it was going to be something I created versus working for somebody else. So I think that was a mindset, while not knowing what that ultimate path was going to be and what the trigger was going to be for that. So yeah, when I went to Ohio State and had my freshman year in the dorms, and second year moved off campus. And when I moved off campus, I moved into a house. And again, life, can often be about luck. Some luck you create and some luck happens to you. It happened to be in the case with the house I moved into was of a guy named Mark Myers. And Mark Myers had purchased, I think it was the first house or one of the first houses he'd ever purchased as a campus landlord. And so he was himself just getting into the business. But during that first year, we developed a relationship, and he ended up buying a couple other houses and actually on the same street, and had asked if I was interested in doing any work for him. I think I was doing some landscaping related things, yard work, just to make some extra cash. But was watching him do what he had done there, which is to grow his small portfolio. And it just seemed really interesting to me. I was always relatively good with my hands. And so watching him work on the properties, and he was doing a lot of the work himself as well. And so I enjoyed that piece of it. And I think in the back of my mind, as I saw that happening, this is something maybe I could do. As a combined passions, I like to work hard. I like manual labor at the same time of thinking about how things get done. And so, yeah, I watched him. He, I think, finished that year with 3 or 4 properties, and it really triggered in my head, if he can do this, I should be able to do this. He was, a few years older than me, but I had sort of looked up to him and recognized that, hey, if he can do it, I can probably do something similar. And yeah, so from there, made the decision. Really was that following year, so it really been my junior year. I sort of joke, it was my second junior year at Ohio State. Had made the decision I wanted to buy a property. Move out of that house, buy a property, bring some roommates in, hopefully have them pay me rent. Maybe I'll live for free, depending on what the math would have been. So yeah, I went to my parents and asked about doing this, and they, unfortunately or fortunately, whatever it may have been, just didn't have the cash to be able to do it. They were supportive of the idea, but just didn't have any money. And so I did go to my girlfriend's grandmother and borrowed $1,500 to buy my first property. My parents did end up co-signing on the loan, but that was a challenge as well. It was a $72,000 house, and I got an FHA loan. So, not a very expensive loan. So we had to search out a few banks till I could find somebody who was willing to give me and my parents a loan to do it. And that was really the trigger. And I can say really the moment I bought that house and I walked into the house, I knew that's what I was going to do the rest of my life. I felt it, the excitement and the ability to make a change to something on your own. So, going in and repainting the house and redoing the landscaping and improving the property and making it better. And then bringing my roommates in. And I, at that point, was living for free and making money. Back in 1994 when I purchased that first property, and that was just the trigger immediately. Like, well, if I had one of these, what if I had 2, 3, or 4 properties? So that's really the genesis and the start of it. And again, once I had the first one, I sort of knew in my head, this is what I'm going to do forever.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. That's always fun and inspiring to hear. Could you talk about like what was the gap between the first property and then the second and the third? Was it almost immediately as soon as you figured out, oh, I know I can do this, or did it
Yeah, it
take?
was pretty quick. It was pretty quick, and I think the reason is the excitement built immediately, and I think my general personality is once I latch onto something, and I believe in it, I'll go relatively quickly in it. And I think that's what happened here. So I bought that property, moved my friends in. My girlfriend, now my wife, she was excited about what I was doing and the opportunity. And I said, listen, you got to do the same thing and buy a house directly across the street, which is what she did. So she bought a house, did a similar scenario of having people live with her. And so then immediately we had cash flow from two properties. And my mind was immediately, well, if I have two, how do I go to three? And I think even, back then this is sort of pre-computer in a way. I mean, I remember just writing out, well, here's one property what I'm making, and then two properties and three and four and five. And, how do I get to do that? Not even factoring in, how do you go about getting financing for that many properties? Where's the money going to come from? I just looked at it and say, how many can I handle on my own, whether it be from a leasing perspective or renovating the properties or managing the properties. So that second property was purchased only a matter of months after the first property, and then just months thereafter for the third.
Gotcha. And then what was kind of what's capital, the limiting factor in the scaling so quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Wasn't that still the case today? Obviously we're a much, much larger company today, and you're typically the growth of our company or our business, could be in real estate or any other businesses. What's the access to capital, either the down payment or the equity or on the financing aspect? And, at the time being, 20 years old, 21 years old, to be purchasing that number of properties with little experience, really no financial backing, and really just an idea and selling that to a lender, is always a challenge. But I always think back, it's usually the hardest one's the first one. Once you can get the first one, and I think you certainly know that, once you've done the first one, the second becomes easier, the third becomes easier once you have some experience. And so yeah, I had that mindset immediately. Once I got the second and third, then I'm like, well, I'm going to get to 100. Is even the first goal. Never once, and we talk about from a philosophy perspective, never once limiting. I never said I'm going to buy 100 and that'll be the end. It was just how do I get to the next goal of this 100, then 500, 1,000, and so forth.
Gotcha. And then from a timetable perspective, do you remember like how many months, how many years it was from one property to, let's say, 50 units, 100 units?
Yeah, I would say it was probably about 24 months to that time frame. And it just because I was obsessed with it. I'm still going to school full time. And so not to say school secondary, but school was secondary. It was really, I wanted to get my degree. My parents wanted me to get the degree. And so I was still going to school full time, but really my brain at the time was really solely focused on buying the property, buying, renovating, managing. So I would go to class, typically, try to schedule my classes in the morning and then immediately get back, change clothes, and go right to work on the properties, or not even change clothes. I certainly remember periods where I'd go to class and realize I'd paint all my clothes. I think I may have run into you a few times with some paint on your hands. And that's really what it was for me. And so I was working, virtually around the clock at that point. So I'd work on the properties, well into the evening or late into the evening. And a little bit later on, I actually took another job. So I would school in the morning, properties all afternoon, and then go to work at 7 p.m. and get home around midnight on a daily basis. And that was just sort of my life for 3 or 4 years. But with all the thought process, even at the other job, my brain was pretty much always on buying property.
Gotcha. And then once were those, let's say you got to 50 units, 100 units, were you buying them? Did they continue to be single family residential properties on camp or off campus, or was it duplexes?
Yeah, they were all on campus, but we did sort of move from the single family to a 2 unit, to a 3 unit, then to a 5, then a 13, then an 18. Each time sort of escalating and pushing the boundary of what was possible for what I thought I was going to be able to do. And certainly you don't do any of those things alone. I was, again, still in my early 20s, and I wasn't in a situation where I could go out and get a $600,000 or $700,000 loan on my own. Although I guess at those points I was doing loans on my own, but it's really the capital side was the bigger issue. And so, I've told this story before, but where life changed for me is, my girlfriend's grandmother again had loaned some of the smaller amount, the $1,500 to do a deal. But then I went back to my high school to see my former teachers, as you often do in the summer, just to say hi and see how everybody was doing, and told my teacher, again, history teacher, one of my favorite teachers, what I was doing. I said, I'm buying these properties. I'm really excited about it. I think this is what I want to do. And he had told me, he's like, well, I own quite a few properties, rental properties here in the Cincinnati area. And if you had any interest, I would invest with you. I hadn't really thought about other people's money up until that point, other than just, again, these small amounts, but not from an investment perspective. And it's sort of it was eye-opening and a triggering moment for me to say, hey, somebody else believes in me. And how could I leverage that relationship into creating a win-win for both of us? And so in the moment, I just threw out and not really, hadn't read any books about it or discussed how structure might be. I said, well, I don't have any money, but I can put the time and effort into it. So what if you put all the money in and I do all the work and we split everything 50-50 on profits? And he said, yes. I mean, it was sort of an immediate response from him. And I remember I drove back to Columbus, like on top of the world, wondering how I could do the next deal. And so I found a property that next day, $58,000 property on campus. I called him and said, "Hey, I've got one for us." And he said, "Great," and bought the property. And I think a really cool part of the story is that when I said we are going to buy it, I started talking about financing. He's like, "I'll just pay cash for it," which at the time to me, 58,000 sounded like 58 million. And so I'm like, that's incredible. And so he bought the house, but a unique portion of the story, and it was sort of life changing for me, almost from a trust perspective. And if people believe in you, what you're capable of, is that we went to close, they had messed up the title work, and this was before LLCs, everything was in my personal name. I didn't know any different. They had messed up the paperwork and only put it in my name and not mine and his. And so I called him and said, "Hey, we can't close today. The paperwork's not right. It's only in my name." He said, "That's fine. Don't worry about it." So he had sent $58,000. I closed the cash in my name with no paperwork. I had no agreement with him other than what we had, other than a handshake. And I've lived by that ever since. I mean, really, any deal that we do is based on a handshake. The agreements at the end of the day matter, certainly at our size. But if I look somebody in the eye and shake their hand and this is what we're going to do and what we do, that's what we're going to do. And that trust he gave me, I was never going to violate under any circumstance because the guy believed in me as a person. And so that was a great launching point to then take that property. And I did renovate that. It's probably one of the most extensive ones I ever did by myself. I took it all the way down to the studs in the house. We drywalled the entire house, rewired. It made huge numbers of mistakes doing it because it was my first one, but it turned out really well. We ended up doing, making really good money on that deal rather quickly. And in that case, in my early 20s, I think I ended up making like $30,000. It again felt like a massive amount of money, and I was able to use that money to then go buy some of the next places along. And of course, he was happy because he had a big return on his investment in a short time frame. So me going forward.
Yeah, I've got a few things on that. One, could you move your computer a little closer to you? I think the microphone started getting a little gravelly, and I know you're sick, but I don't think your voice is that gravelly. But going back to what you said, yeah, that was one eye-opening moment when I was working here at Crawford Hoying on the finance team, is how much, because in class you're always told like real estate is all about the relationships and doing business with people you trust. And again, my third week at Crawford Hoying was when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So I got to see that in real life as a 20-year-old. And I was blown away about how real that note was. And I think that has been a principle in Crawford Hoying's work over the last 28 or 29, however many years Crawford Hoying's been here. All right. Speaking of not doing things by yourself and trust, I want to move the conversation towards the decision to partner with the other name in Crawford Hoying, Sir Bob Hoying. Could you open up about that relationship, how you guys found that, and just briefly mention the story, but because it's funny, but we'll talk more about how you guys decided to trust each other, how you built that trust, and how you ended up structuring the whole company.
Yeah, for sure. It certainly wasn't a planned event. We hadn't known each other for a long time, and suddenly made this decision. We met randomly on the golf course in 2007, I believe. No, I'm sorry, 1997. Yeah, just got paired together. I never played golf by myself, or excuse me, with strangers. He doesn't either. And we both got to the course that day, and there were no openings, and they put us together. And I was a graduate of Ohio State when he was a senior quarterback, so I was a huge fan at the time. And so I was got the chance to meet him, but never made any acknowledgement that he played football for the entire round of golf. He asked a lot about what I did in business, and I told him I was in real estate and loved it. He probably knew that I knew who he was, but we didn't talk much about it. And I think he was really excited to learn about something, talk about something other than football. And so we just hit it off from there. Agreed to connect following that round, which we did. And as it turns out, he had a passion to get into something else besides football, post football. He had a rough connection to real estate, and that his father owned a general contracting business. And so through that connection, he always had interest in real estate. And that was sort of the genesis of our relationship, is him being curious and wondering about the business. And over the next few years, as he would come back in the off season, we would get together more and talk more about real estate and what his passion was and where he might be able to fit in the business. And that happened over a number of years. And then about 4 years later is when we made the decision to partner together going forward. I was well into my business. I think I had over 1,000 units at the time, well over 1,000 units. Thought he would be a good add to the company from his work ethic. his relationships in the marketplace, and obviously he had a known name, and then really spent the next years working together and sort of bringing him up to speed on how our business worked, and it's been a great relationship ever since.
That doesn't surprise me that Bob didn't bring up that he played football. So you had 1,000, let's say 1,000 units before that conversation. What was your thought process? Because you seem like not that you're like untrusting or like you'd rather pull up your sleeves and do the work yourself to a point where it's not worth your time. But what was it like going through your brain on, is it worth partnering with someone? I've built this company that's got 1,000 units over the last 4 years. I've got the whole world in front of me. What was that like for you?
It's interesting. I do like to do things myself, and I'm not one to typically ask for help. These are faults. I'll usually want to just get it done myself, but recognize there becomes a point, either in a business or in your own life, what you're capable of doing. And I'm also a social person and enjoy doing things in a team environment and working with other people, and recognizing, if I'm doing this business and doing it for the most part by myself, there's joy in it, but maybe not the same joy as having a team and building something and doing something greater. It's sort of a common good amongst a group of people. And I recognize that, if I could do this with another person who also had a passion about the business, and we just sort of combined interests and had different skill sets and to apply to the business, that we could ultimately be more successful. And that's the part that's really transferred through the company over the years, is that I get more passion and excitement from other people in the company doing really well and growing and learning about the business as I do from the actual business of real estate at this point. And recognizing, if you build a great team, we always say do great things with great people and you get great results. And that has certainly has happened for us. And we've learned over the years that you just got to surround yourself with great people. And so that transition certainly was hard to say, hey, I own 100% of the business and now I own 50% of the business. And how do you make that decision? But it was more valuable to me to build a great organization than it was to be in 100% control.
Gotcha. That I'm sure was not an easy decision. It wouldn't be an easy decision for me. But it's clearly done well. Let's talk about, so the team right now, Crawford Holdings probably got 80 people in the corporate office and probably hundreds of people with property managers, maintenance staff, all of that. What was the team back in the early days when you were scaling this? I mean, you were doing some of the work, you were looking at properties. Was there a certain point where you said, hey, maybe I should bring in a few other people to help out because this is just too much for one person?
Yeah, I think so. One of the keys to this business, you've got to get your hands dirty. And I think I had told you that sort of from the beginning. Even if you don't like to get your hands dirty, it's very difficult to get in this business, buy a property and say, I'm just going to buy it and let somebody else manage it and do all the work. You're going to call every time there's a leaky faucet to a plumber to come fix it. It's very expensive HVAC. And then when a unit turns, you got to paint it and clean it. And I was never afraid to get my hands dirty. And so really from day one, I did, I leased the apartment, then I turned the apartment. So I was painting it, cleaning it. I would rent a carpet cleaning machine. I was doing all the maintenance. And if there were significant renovations, I would do those as well to the property. It's not to say that I was good at all of them. I certainly got better over the years, but it's hard to guide and tell people what to do if you don't know how to do it yourself. So I think over the years, the maintenance team, certainly in the first few years, respected what I would say as it related to doing something because I had done it myself. I was not afraid to get my hands dirty. So there's a plumbing backup on a unit. And in some cases, I had walked into a couple feet of raw sewage in a unit. I cleaned it up myself. And so they understood that, I was willing to get their hands dirty. So if I'm asking them to get their hands dirty, they knew I had done it. It's not only good for that experience and to be able to relate to the people you're asking to do the job at a later point in your career, but the profit margins, you need to be able to make as much money as you can across all the ways. And so I was charging myself essentially, or charging the property to paint it, to clean it, and to do the leasing, to do all the work. And so really up through almost 1,000 units, I was essentially doing 100% of all the work. So I was going all day long doing maintenance calls. And then if there was a unit that needed to be turned, I was then going and painting the unit, cleaning the unit. And it was virtually a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour operation. But my mindset at the time is I can do it. I'm young, I can work hard. But it certainly became a point where it was too much. The maintenance calls were coming and units were turning, and I'd maybe have to turn 10 units in a few days. And I was trying to paint them, clean them, carpet clean them, do all the maintenance to get them ready to turn. So there's only so many hours in the day. But I did, eventually got to a point where I said, I need, a full-time maintenance person. And even when I had the 1,000, there was other people involved. I couldn't do 100%, but I was trying to do 100%. When I couldn't, I would call out, some local handymen essentially to help me get them done. But I just think it's really important to get your hands really dirty. It doesn't mean you have to do it forever, but to really understand how long does it take to turn a unit? What's it cost to turn a unit? So if at a certain point, we had maintenance people doing the work and they would say, well, it took me this many units to paint the unit or this many hours to paint the unit, I would know better. I'd say, well, I know it only takes this long to paint the unit. And so again, that's just really important. And also, as you're getting quotes later on from other people to, plumber said it's going to be $400 to replace a faucet. Well, it doesn't cost that. It doesn't take that much time. So I think those are really important pieces. There are some people that are scared of that. They don't know how to do it. They don't want to learn. Then I might say, well, partner with someone who you might have in the business who does like to do it. And so maybe you're on the accounting side, on the leasing side, the finance, the capital stack, and then your partner's really focused on the unit turns and the maintenance and renovations and things like that.
Gotcha. That's good advice. Speaking of kind of delegating, partnering, skill based on skill set, it's funny to hear your skills when you're growing this, because now I know that your skills are on the finance side of things, or at least that's where you spend most of your time. What was the primary skill set that you were using to grow this company? And then can you talk a little bit about how that's evolved over time?
Yeah, I'd say, really, the fact is, I am on the finance side, probably more on the capital stack side. And I've used a lot of my intuition to get me to where I am today. My skill set, as you well know, on like an Excel perspective, I know 1% of what you know. But I was able to look at it in a different manner. I feel as though if I have a skill set, I can sort of see the bigger picture of numbers and how they all work together. I'm not nearly as skilled as you are on sort of the nuanced pieces of spreadsheets and Excel, but I would say it was probably intuition for me personally. Not everybody can act on that. Like the ability to look at a specific deal to a property and in my head sort of work through the process of what is the property now? What could the property be if I did these things to it? Understanding what I'm looking at from a physical asset perspective, meaning is this a well-built property? Where are the big issues that might lie in the property? People do sometimes get themselves in trouble, especially if you're buying campus area properties that are 100+ years old. What are you looking at in the structure? Where are the areas that you didn't think? You pay 200 for a property, but not realizing that basement wall is going to cost you 40 grand to fix. So I think my skill set was really the drive, sort of the tireless effort piece of it, and then the ability just from a big picture perspective to understand this individual property. How does it fit within the marketplace, the neighborhood? What's the global and macro environment right now? Are we a declining interest rate environment or a rising interest rate environment? Are prices going up or down? And knowing when to push really hard to buy and maybe when to pull back to buy. So there's that's a difficult one because it's not I can't put my thumb to say here's the exact skill set. Some of it is just you have to have the ability to see sort of the bigger picture, the property individually itself, but then look at the bigger picture of how a property fits into the current, again, macro environment, and then just the economy as a whole.
Gotcha. All right. So let's get back to it. You talked a little bit about not necessarily timing the markets, but knowing where you're at in markets and understanding risks and opportunities and all that. Can you talk about what the market looked like in that early or late 1990s, early 2000s period when you were scaling the company?
Yeah, I think again, some of this comes down to timing, right? I was fortunate when I bought my first property in 1994. We were in a depressed market. Real estate values were down pretty significantly over that time frame, and so I was buying in during that time frame. Did I know they were depressed at the time? I didn't. I didn't have knowledge and history because of my age, and I hadn't done research to say what were the values in 1987. I just knew what they were that day. As it turns out, I bought into my fortuitous timing there. I think also what played into it is it was really for the most part pre-internet, meaning if you weren't in the real estate game, there weren't what you see today, which is whether it be advertisements or Facebook or Instagram or wherever it may be, podcasts, things like that, talking about getting in the real estate industry. So I felt like the competition was much less when we were going to buy properties. It just wasn't as challenging as it is today. And so I think that absolutely played a role into it. I'll also say, when I bought my first properties, I had a number of loans that were 8%, 8.5%, 9.5%, 10%. And I do remember having a few in the 11% range. So when people talk about what rates are doing today and it seems impossible, you can make a lot of money when rates are high, but you can't have real estate values really high and interest rates really high, which is the scenario that we're in now, which is why it's cooled so dramatically in the last year or so.
Right. If you to go more into that, if you had to guess, like let's say you were getting 8% interest rates, like could you take a guess at what the average cap rate was? Just I'm trying to compare what interest rates were or interest rates.
Yeah, it reminds you that when I was buying those properties, campus properties, they were older properties, and obviously they're looked at a little differently than the sort of things that we do today. But cap rates would have been 8+, percent, even as high as 11, depending on the age of the property and so forth. So they were relatively high. Cap rates got to where they were. So we sold properties in the last couple of years where cap rates in the 3s, and that is just from the historically low interest rates. So I think a lot of young investors, what they're seeing now with the rates increasing as being abnormal. What's really abnormal is the rates that we've had for the last 10 plus years. These zero plus from a Federal Reserve, prime interest rate being zero, and low threes. People had home mortgages in the twos. That is historically very unusual. I'm not sure we'll ever go back there again. Where we're going to now is the more historical norm. But unfortunately, when you have rates go to that level that quickly, it can be a shocking situation to real estate owners, especially with floating interest rates. As the rates go up dramatically, obviously values have to come down, and there's going to have to be a reset on expectations for where cap rates will be on properties. And those are certainly going to rise as long as interest rates rise, and our higher cap rates are going to remain high. I don't know. I'm not sure we'll ever see a lifetime where cap rates go, back to 3.5% or 4%, or in some cases, people paid even more aggressively for those.
Yeah, very, very interesting time for me to enter the market. All right, going back to when you were growing this portfolio, it was kind of an industry that if you didn't know somebody in, it was hard to get into. There wasn't the internet. You didn't come from a real estate family. Yep. Like, did you have mentors? How were you kind of sourcing all this knowledge or know-how? And granted, I mean, you certainly have instilled in me, like, you don't need to know all the answers, but were there mentors that kind of helped you along the way that said, hey, here's how much time you need in due diligence?
Yeah, again, I've always had that. I've never had a lot of fear. Fear is not something I feel a lot when I'm looking at something. I'm always generally looking what can go right. A lot of people look at what can go wrong, and that'll certainly limit the speed in which you can grow and what you can do. Because if you're living in a fearful life and fearful of what can go wrong, it will certainly tame your growth. And fear is not a bad thing. It can protect you from doing stupid things. But I always sort of relied on the fact that I was relatively fearless and had confidence in my ability to analyze the situation. I've not certainly batted 1,000. I've made my mistakes. And I always sort of had the mentality that I could do it on my own. And that's not necessarily a positive thing. I wish I would have sought out more advice early on. But I always wanted to fix whatever issue was myself without asking for advice. With that being said, through osmosis and meeting people in the business, I was certainly listening to them and taking advice. Maybe not while asking for it. Sometimes certainly people in the business will give the advice, just as like you may not ask me for advice, but I may recognize or see something and offer it up. Don Kenny is a name that's synonymous in Columbus. I'm pretty confident to say he's built the most apartments in Columbus, Ohio history. He's still extremely active in the marketplace. I don't know Don's age now, but probably in his late 70s, early 80s, and has many thousands of units under construction in Columbus. So he gave me a break early on. I would not be where I am today without him. And that's because as I started to transition away from campus properties and looking at some of the things you see around the outer belt of Columbus, you got your traditional 200 units with a pool and a clubhouse. And that's where I really wanted to graduate to, was to that type of property. And so I walked in the door and said, you have this for sale, but I know I'm of this age and, here's my history, but I really want to buy it. And they would, sell me the property, but do seller carrybacks for portions of the deal, let me carry paper with them essentially to help cover the down payment. But that only comes from developing the relationship and a trust. And they believed I was going to do what I said I was going to do. I was going to ultimately pay them back the money that was owed. So that was certainly a help. And I saw how he was running his business and how many units he had acquired. And he had started the same way with a single house on Ohio State campus. And again, probably the largest developer in Columbus, Ohio history as it relates to apartments. Casto played a really big role in where we are today. And they did that by, in a similar manner, is they were building properties, they were selling them to me. And at that time, Bob, as he had come into the business, and they also did seller carry, creative financial structures in order for us to buy those properties. And just like when you're buying one house, once you bought the first house, it's easier to buy the second, and so forth. Well, it's the same thing when you're buying large properties. Once you buy your first $15 million property, it makes it easier to buy the next one at 15, and then the next one might be at 20, and then 25. For me too, I never really look at numbers. People get overwhelmed. I even had friends who, wanted to get in the business, but they were overwhelmed and scared when they start to hear something. It's $1 million and $2 million. Like, you got to pay that back. Yeah, you got to pay it back. But to me, it was whether it was 100,000, 1 million, 10 million, or 100 million. It's just what's the model? What's the execution of the deal? And I never was really fearful of the fact that, hey, I just borrowed $70 million on a deal. You just got to, have your plan, put it in place, and execute on it. So yeah, those are a couple mentors who I followed and watched the scale from them starting.
All right, we're back.
Yeah, you're frozen.
Sorry about that. Whoever's office I'm in. All right. Well, thank you for that. You talked about your reputation. You talked about being fearless. You talked about all of these different things that facilitated your success. What were some of the points that you realized? Because I'm sure a lot of people bought their first property, and then a little bit less bought a second property. And then over the years, you start seeing a bunch of these real estate investors kind of weed out over time. And certainly not like owning tens of thousands of units isn't everyone's goal. What was one thing that you saw as the like primary, not indicator, but what kind of differentiated you and a lot of the people that may have had your ambitions when you were 18, 20 years old, 25 years old?
Yeah, I think the willingness to you have to be willing to take risk. I mean, there's not reward without risk. And so uh, I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I had friends who specifically wanted to get in the business. And when I was selling my campus properties, I had offered them up an incredible deal at the time. Basically, I'll set the price at such an amount where I'll then lend you back your down payment. You don't have to put any money down. And ultimately, one of my friends, college roommates, ended up not doing the deal. He's like, "That's a lot of risk and a lot of money." I'm like, "Well," but at the same time, he wanted all the benefits of owning a lot of real estate. So you can't get both. You got to be willing to put the time and effort in and take the risk. I ended up having another college roommate do the deal. He ended up making a lot of money on that deal, and so did I. So it was a win-win for both of us. But I think you got to be willing to take the risk. You got to be willing to put the effort, and that is where they'll get one, two, three houses, and then they don't want to take the phone call at night at 10 p.m. when the faucet's leaking or the toilet's leaking, and they get frustrated because they don't want to do the work, but they got to call it out, and they're not making enough money. But real estate's one you got to. We do buy and we do sell, but really the best way for real estate is to buy and hold. It's just it's the best method, and it's been true for years. Now there is always a time to sell. But I think it's people sticking to it and recognizing that, it's still, I think, the case. Obviously, you've seen technology come into play, but the most wealth in the history of the world's been made from real estate. And I don't think that's changing anytime soon. You just got to be willing to stick with it. Scale matters, right? Getting to enough properties that make a difference. You have to make a decision whether this is just an ancillary income and business to help your retirement in 30 years, or is it the business of real estate that you want to be in? And there is a difference. I've told a lot of my friends, if you just bought one property a year for the next 30 years, you're going to be a multimillionaire many times over from that by just buying one property a year and holding those property and leasing those properties. And that's not necessarily a scenario where, if you did it for 30 years and you had 30 properties around Columbus where it's the most overwhelming thing in your life and you can't manage it. But it is, and there's no guarantees in life, but it's probably one of the safest guarantees that you'll retire very well from that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's been one thing that it's been interesting to see as I've met more people in the industry of what their goals are and what that equates to units and what that looks like from a lifestyle standpoint. Do we want a big company? Do we want a small company? And it's been interesting to see what differentiates them, and your many more years of experience is an interesting perspective on that.
Yeah, you have to make a decision whether you want to be. There is a fine line. It's, whether you're going to stay small, run it yourself. You can often make a lot of money. I mean, I've said from maybe a profit perspective on a per unit basis, probably the most money I ever made was when I had 500 to 1,000 units. And the reason being is I was doing a lot of it myself. I could control it all. I didn't have a corporate office. It was a great way to do it, but there becomes a limit in time where it's like, okay, I'm either going to stay at this level or I want to grow the business to another level. And it often doesn't work at 1,500 units or 2,000 units. It's like, hey, we're going to stay at 500 or we're going to go to 5,000 plus. And that's sort of and I'd made that decision at one point. Hey, I think I have a model and a culture and a business that we could grow something into much larger than what we're currently going. And that's not for everybody. They just got to make the decision. What I'll say is, whether you're in, you bought 10 units and that's all you ever bought the rest of your life, and it ends up being 10,000, it's a great business to be in.
Yeah, that's a good one to start wrapping up with. The last question I'll ask is, was there a big first deal? I mean, obviously the first deal is always a big deal for you, but was it the 200 plus units in the suburbs, or was there a certain deal that sticks out to you that said, I'm sure I would have figured it out, but this one was certainly an accelerator on your growth?
I think it was timing. Meaning, if you remember, I purchased in a relatively down market. One of the reasons that market was down because interest rates were high, and so which means cap rates were higher and values were down, and so I bought at that period. And then as interest rates came down, cap rates came down, and so it wasn't one deal specifically. It was more a matter of that a lot of the properties I had purchased, at that time, some of the smaller properties, I paid 100 grand and then sold them for 200 grand after making some renovations, rent increases, plus cap rates dropped. I think we're in that scenario now. So as I think about opportunity, the challenges the market's facing now, again, really rapidly rising interest rates, people who bought property in 2019, and just as a rough, scale, somebody paid, these are larger properties, obviously, but somebody paid 30 million for a property. They paid it at a 3.5 cap because interest rates were really low, but maybe they only did a 5-year loan. that loan's going to come due and that property's worth dramatically less. So as I look at from a philosophy perspective, while this is a very challenging market, it is entering a period of which this is the time to be the buyer, because as cap rates have risen, values have fallen there. So as I think about it, I always would rather be, sort of think of it in this manner. The value of the property is always the value of the property, meaning basis, and versus interest rates. Basis, what you pay for the property is what you will have always paid for the property. The interest rate you get is temporary. And so would I rather pay 30 million for a property with a 3.5% interest rate for a period of time, or would I rather pay $24 million for the property with an 8% interest rate? I would rather pay 24 million, temporarily make less because interest rates are really high, because that will expire at some point. Rates will come down, but what you paid for the property is always what you paid for the property. And so it's why we were much more likely to be sellers from 2018 through 22 than we were buyers. And we're more likely to be buyers now than we are sellers. We want to be in these markets where there's distress and opportunity, and those are going to start to come. I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg for the downturn that we could see in the market. And it really will come down to how high do interest rates go and how hard, how hard does the market fall? There could be significant downturn where prices really, really drop. If you've already purchased your property, it's not a reason to panic because you haven't lost any money unless you decide to sell the property. So we've been through many cycles. A very quick one is, we paid $58 million for a property in 2006. We got an appraisal for $34 million in 2009. In 2017, we sold that property for $113 million. So there's a scenario where sometimes you have to go through cycles and wait those cycles out and the ebb and flow of the market. But it tells you that it is always about the basis. The person who paid us $113 million, depending on what loan they got, if that loan's expiring now, all right? So in that property's value, because cap rates are maybe down dramatically, but they may be in a scenario too. They just need to wait it out like we did. So maybe they get an appraisal now for 90 million. They paid 113, and in 7 years they'll sell it for 160 million. These are the ebbs and flows of the market. If you can certainly, you can't time it exactly right, but you can recognize that when values are falling, that's the time to buy, and when values are really high, that's the time to sell.
Basis.
All right. Rates are temporary.
Yep. Yeah, I think in the single family residential world, they say date the rate and marry the home or something. Anyways, last question. Do you have any advice for young real estate professionals, or do you want to highlight any fun things that Crawford Holdings is working on right now? Some of your projects, just to highlight to the people. Most of these listeners are probably in Columbus, so they'll probably be familiar with the area.
I'd say a couple things. One, in general, just as it relates to the market, if you're in Columbus, Ohio, we are in one of the best markets in the country to be in. I can tell you, as we work with investors, lenders from around the country and the world for that matter, Columbus, Ohio is on the top of the list. We are absolutely one of the most well-recognized markets in as far as where to put money. So there are groups coming from around the country, which is good and bad. It's driven our prices up here more than we expected. When we were buying our properties, 15, 20 plus years ago, almost all the buyers and sellers were Columbus, Ohio, which is what put a little bit on where prices could go because there wasn't outside capital. That's not the case anymore. A significant portion, I'd say certainly well above 50% of the buyers for properties here are buyers from outside Columbus, Ohio, and often they're on the coast or they're even international buyers. So you're in Columbus, Ohio, in an incredible market because we have job growth here, we have population growth, and there's continued demand, and we're not building enough housing units to satisfy the growth. So the prices here should continue to move up for years to come because we don't have policies in place to build enough units to satisfy the need. So it's a supply and demand market. As we think about the timing, I've always thought of it in this way: every day that goes by is a day you never get back in investing. And so to try to time the market to the day is really challenging. So despite what I'd said earlier, about basis, often people, especially in their early 20s, they're always waiting for the right moment to buy. Well, if you were 22 and could have bought a property, but you waited till you're 25, and maybe you got a better price or maybe you didn't. But what I do know is you lost 3 years of principal pay down. You lost 3 years of experience on the property, and you're just pushing the game out a little bit farther. So not being afraid to pull the trigger, not having that fear that, hey, I paid $200,000 for a property, and what if it's worth $190,000 next year? I could have got it for $190,000. Maybe you could, or maybe you couldn't have. It's similar to the stock market. You can't time it to the minute. So not being afraid, not trying to time it exactly, but maybe it means that in this volatile market, you're not going all in right now. But it doesn't mean you should just sit on the sidelines.
Great. Well, thanks, Brent. That is great advice. I'm excited for people to listen in. I will link other podcasts that Brent and Bob have done in the past. Thank you, Brent Crawford, founder of Crawford Holdings.
Thank you.